Welcome to Tuesday 10 at 10. Today we have a panel for you because we just have so many questions coming through, and I decided why don't we just invite Alan on to answer his questions. So if you have more questions, I might just invite you to our panel. We have two experts today. We have Richard Charpentier from Baking Innovations, and Peter Reinhardt, the godfather of pizza books and bread books. I mean, who else do I know have published over 10 books, you know? So welcome, guys, and welcome, Alan. Can you hear me?
Thank you.
Okay.
So I'm an enthusiastic, I'm an enthusiastic home baker in San Francisco, and I'm using my obsessive compulsive quarantine baking time to try to finally learn to make croissants at home, which of course is a challenge. And so that's led me to think a lot about butter, and what makes butter better or worse for making croissants. And so my questions, and I don't think we have time for all of them today, but to begin with, at a microscopic level, what makes one butter more plastic instead of brittle than another? And just as background, what I've already read from On Food and Cooking is that butter is, in general terms, amorphous fat inside of which is floating milk solids, emulsified water, some air bubbles, and in particular also fat globules, and also butter crystals, butterfat crystals in a variety of both structures and sizes. So could you say more than now? I don't know if that, let me know if that's correct, and if so, also, how does all that affect the plasticity of butter?
Richard, you're the French pastry chef who's trained in France, certified baker. Why don't you just go ahead and take a stab at it first?
All right. Yes, there is something up to what you're saying, Alan. And from the research that I've done in the past, and again, we're talking about on the microscopic level, there's crystal that being formed, and there was some studies being done where they would look at the crystal that were more beneficial for cakes or for application. And I think the alpha crystal versus the beta crystal were better. And then people would basically look and say, how can I produce it more? There's a short story on that where a friend of mine, Peter Ewan, used to be with the World Cup of Baking as a expert in lamination. And him and I were talking years ago, and he would do something to his butter to really increase the level of alpha crystal to get better quality croissant. And I think if I recall it right, don't quote me on it, it would just sort of brown it a little bit. So basically remove the moisture to create a concentration of crystal in his butter. And yes, and on the large manufacturing scales, they do buy butter that is already a certain plasticity. But usually, as a rule of thumb, in a regular bakery, croissants are done through temperature of the fat to create plasticity, because of the more solid, the more brittle it becomes. So, as the rule of thumb, your temperature of your dough has to be the same temperature of your fat.
Okay.
What I was hearing in the question too was, as part of it is that American butter tends to be about 80% butter fat. European butter maybe 82 to 85% butter fat. Does the amount of butter fat affect the plasticity? On one level, you think more fat, more plastic. On the other hand, the colder that butter gets, the more brittle those crystals become. So I'm just wondering if the quantity is that part of your question also, Alan?
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to really drill down more on this structure of alpha crystal versus beta crystal versus crystal size a little bit more. And I do want to get to the water if we have time. I mean, because it's hard for me to imagine how water will make butter more brittle, because water is extremely plastic. But back to that microscopic question then, so how is butter represented? I mean, if I was a butter professional, I worked at, Challenge Creamery. I mean, if I was coming out of the machine, how would I represent butter to know if I was doing it well today or badly today? I mean, the only numbers I know so far on butter are 80% butter fat. Sometimes it's 84% butter fat. If I was a butter professional, how would I represent butter?
I believe you can first thing is percentage fat, right? And there is a certain method, AOAC method, that we can analyze for a percentage saturation. Most butter is already saturated anyway. Quality of butter really depends on the amount of fat versus water. A lot of the Pelugra butter, you know, that French, nice French butter is very high in solids, you know. And the ones that we find in our regular, you know, generic store brand butter, which I never buy for pastry anyway, has higher amount of water. So the FDA has a regulated way of saying what can be called butter and how much water is in there. So it's on our butter page on Bakerpedia.
So if I have two different butters that have the same amount of butter fat, will they be equally plastic?
It should be. It should be, but you don't, you know, that's why people like President and Pelugra are such great brands, because they have specific processing steps in their butter processing to make it more pliable, you know, and that's why they're
what is those steps achieve that makes them more pliable?
Like Richard said, I think it's towards the development of more alpha crystals, you know.
So
and I don't know
those people measure the amount of alpha crystals versus some other type of crystals?
I think it's just alpha and beta, right, Richard?
Yeah, alpha and beta. You might have some beta prime from one article, but yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and I believe producing alpha crystals might take a different technique, might take more time or something like that. That's why it's more expensive in general.
So is it the ratio of alpha crystals to beta crystals, or is it the amount of water that's really making it plastic? Because I can understand how different, I mean, in chocolate, for example, when you temper chocolate, you try to make it all one type of crystal that is the most brittle, that is the highest melting point. I would think that when you're making butter, you'd want to do it the reverse. You want to get it to be you'd want it all to be whatever crystal is the weakest and whatever.
So I think it's a combination of both. You want more alpha and you want less water.
How does water make something more brittle? Because
because you're talking about water. Water is a polar molecule, and lipids, fats are non-polar molecules. They don't mix well together. The more you have water in the system, the more it's going to disrupt the non-polar molecules, right? So you want the polar molecules to really bind to each other and form a continuous film. Water does not help with that. Water repels, and when you get a non-polar and a polar molecule together, they just don't get well together. So the more water you have in the system, the more brittle it's going to be. The more alpha and the higher the fat, the more pliable it's going to be. I think that's how it works in pastry and pastry margarines.
And that's even though butter has natural emulsifiers in it.
Even though butter has the worst emulsifiers in it, even though it's some emulsification going on. If I were an industrial pastry, you know, flaky pastry producer, I would go full on pastry margarine, because butter will not handle in my system. You know, so it goes to you as a home baker. I mean, if you just want to use butter because of the fragrance and all that nice aromatic, you know, qualities that comes with butter, all the better, you know. But if you want to be a little serious and you want to scale up, you know, you really need to move on to something more plastic like pastry margarine, which is easier to handle.
Is there any way to manipulate butter? So what we've come to is the water disrupts the internal structure, which makes it more brittle.
Mm-hmm.
And we've also come to that some crystals are better than other crystals. Is there any way to manipulate butter so that I can buy cheap butter to make it behave better? I mean, if it's all one type of crystal, there's something I can do to manipulate it.
I think Richard had a great suggestion. Right?
If you look, Alan, in large manufacturers of uh, laminated doughs and viennoiserie and those type of croissants and danishes. What they do is basically they temper the temperature of the butter, so therefore they put like the blocks into a big hopper at the right temperature, and it's crucial. And basically it sheets down a band and the same temperature of the dough, and as long as the temperature of the dough and the temperature and temperature of both dough and butter are similar, yes, they're able to do it. I've seen people do all butter, but one thing that I was while we were talking, reading through some notes, the beta crystal is the least stable of the crystal, and that's why most of the people would prefer, you take butter, but once it's in a beta form, that's why you're better off with margarines, things that have been maybe man-made or produced by a fat manufacturer, and you'll be better off in the large scale.
Yeah, and I've not tried clarified butter. Maybe that,
Yeah, you would get more, I think.
Butter? I've not tried clarified butter. So
basically,
right.
you clarify the butter, then you solidify it, then you don't have all those milk solids in there, which would then make it much more plastic and less brittle. Is that the theory?
yeah.
Yeah, but it might, when you make fudge, you've got to agitate it very carefully so you end up with very small crystals. Or when you make chocolate, so it might be a lot of, if you cool off butter, you might have to do a lot of things very carefully so that it doesn't get more brittle.
I know. Well, you start to get into.
So you need to understand that chocolate is an entirely different system. Like chocolate is all fat and all solids. Like there's no water in there, hardly any kind of water. It's a completely different system. So I don't think it's fair to really cross compare these two systems.
Right.
Yeah, I think if you really want a better butter system for your home baking, it has to be what you can obtain at the grocery shelves, either like a Precedent or a Plugra or even Kerry. Kerry butter has really, really high total solids. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
All right, that's my question.
But I think the simple answer in terms of, manipulating your butter to me is do it at the right temperature. Like if you can work it at 60 degrees Fahrenheit, it's going to be much more plastic than if you're working it at 50 degrees or 55 degrees. I remember way back when the United States entered their very first team in the Coupe du Monde back in 1992, I believe it was. And we were very inexperienced on the world stage. The person who was handling the anniversary and doing the croissants had been practicing for a whole year to get his croissants just dialed in. And then when he went over for the competition, they gave him different butter. They gave him European butter to work with, and it didn't perform, and it cracked. In the competition, his butter cracked, and his croissants were, obviously subpar. And I think a lot of it had to do with temperature control, and the amount of butter fat and temperature just really varies. But I've always been told that 60 degrees is sort of an ideal working temperature for plasticity, but regardless of what kind of butter you're using.
Yeah.
So but that's not the scientific drill down answer. That's the more like everyday, home baker.
It's a mix of both, right, Peter? We have to understand it's a mix of both practicality and science. We need to use science to drive the practicality aspect of things, and that's what industrial manufacturing is all about. It's all about a science, and then practicality. How are people and machines going to deal with that? So a lot of knowledge, experience is needed, like yours. And so let me carry on. Ellen, do you have any more questions, or should we move on to our question queue?
You can move on.
All right. So hope you don't mind staying on. Let me look at my question queue. The first one is, I had a question on frozen pizza with no red sauce and having a lot of olive oil as a topping. How does that impact in terms of baking after frozen? I noticed the crust is usually more chewy, and it has been difficult to get a good crunch and a soft balance. So he's looking for dual texture, crunch and chewy, right? That's what I'm thinking. I think it's due to the olive oil topping, but I can never find any online resource on the impact of olive oil as a topping, and its effect on the crunch of the pizza and the softness in the center. So can you elaborate on the impact of olive oil on topping on frozen pizza? Thank you.
I guess what I'm not totally clear on is the frozen pizza dough coming with the olive oil already on it on top, or is he applying the olive oil when he takes the frozen dough to the oven?
So basically, it's frozen with, it looks to me like it's frozen with the olive oil topping on top.
Well, I mean, generally speaking, I always think of the oil being a tenderizing agent. At the same time that while it's baking, is also kind of frying the dough. So you can sometimes get, especially on the underside, if you're baking in a pan and you have dough in a pan that's been greased with olive oil, you're going to get a really nice toasty, kind of buttery quality to it. Whereas on top, the oil should start to kind of absorb through and sink into the dough and tenderize the top surface, you would think. And it sounds like what he's getting is not having that experience, but that he's getting maybe the top of his pizza is drying out a little bit and getting too crisp for his liking. Is that how, am I hearing that question correctly?
I think he's not getting dual texture on it. It's not getting the crisp and the chew. I think it's just getting soggy.
Yeah.
I really think that it's got a lot to do with the bake. And I think that you can find a better baking apparatus, either like a stronger oven on a stone with some kind of a broiling element. But then again, I think that there needs to be more information on this particular pizza. What do you think, Richard? Limited information.
Similarly to both you and Peter, if you take a pizza crust, the first thing too I was thinking is, what's the thickness? Are we talking about a bubbly thick pizza crust with olive oil? You put it in an oven at 350 for 5 minutes, it's warmed up, but it gets soggy, it will get soggy. And it's funny because sometimes I do buy the chapati, the Indian bread, and I put a little bit of olive oil on the surface of the chapati, and I put it in the pan and warm it up, and I do get it crispy when I get it hot enough. So I think I agree with Lynn. Temperature will make a big difference, and depending on thickness, depending on, are they taking it completely, frozen from the freezer and put in the oven, that's going to create issues. So maybe the question is, how do they process their frozen crust, and either thawed or completely frozen, and how do they bake it?
Right.
I like that idea of using the dual heat, perhaps heating that stone up really hot, get it up to as high as the oven will allow, and then bring the broiler on when you put the crust under there, maybe for the last 30 seconds or a minute, and really finish the top off much faster, which would tend to set it and keep it maybe from soaking into clogging out the dough.
I thought baking, that's got a lot to do with baking. Peter, you're like the pizza king. Do you have a class coming up that you can share, teach, or?
Well, actually, what I have been doing is, and we haven't started to post them yet on my own website, Pizza Quest, but in fact, we're doing these interviews right as we speak this week, lots of them, and in about a week, we're going to launch them on pizzaquest.com, interviews with some of the great pizza makers of the world, mostly in North America, but nice one-on-one interviews. And we also have a dough panel with a couple of dough experts, including one from your neck of the woods in Portland, Brian Spangler from Pizza Shoals, one of my favorite pizzerias. And we actually get into Q&A and talking about how to tinker with your dough to make it better. And it's aimed at both professional pizza operators, but also home cooks and people who want to be able to produce, professional level pizzas in a home oven. And so we have all these great little conversations with some great pizza makers. Chris Bianco from Pizzeria Bianco's coming on. We have tomato experts. We've got, so anyway, we're going to be dedicating the next couple of months during this age of COVID, the COVID age, to lots of Zoom interviews like this to introduce people to the great pizza makers and find out what allows them to kind of separate from the pack. Why did they become the well-known guys, and the 98% of the other pizza makers are doing great, but they're not, they're not the ones that are considered memorable pizzas. They're just good pizzas. And so Pizza Quest is always about exploring the difference between good and great. And we're trying to find out what that little difference is between the good and the great pizzas.
That's great. So pizzaquest.com.
Right.
Right. Go there, people. Learn more about.
And of course, we do have demos, and we have videos and instructionals and all sorts of stuff besides that. But this is the new content that we're putting up. Are these interviews? But if you go to the webisode section of the website, you'll see videos that we've been posting for a couple of years that have some great instructional information as well.
Great. All right. So let's wrap up with the last question. On our fermentation episode, what happens with dough taste if you ferment it for more than 5 hours? Long fermentation, guys. Richard, why don't you take a stab at it first?
All right. So, just going back to the basis of fermentation, yeast is producing carbon dioxide and some alcohol, and the longer, and producing organic acids such as lactic that will create more flavor. And as you ferment longer, your overall pH keeps on dropping, but it sort of plateaus. You get, depending on what strain of yeast, but it weakens. It can strengthen your overall gluten network, but if you go, depending on what temperature, let's say room temperature, you can weaken it, because then therefore the expansion and the fermentation, I'm thinking of already a shaped bread or baguette, and it will get weaker over time, unless it's at the right temperature, between 55 to 65 degrees, slow fermentation, that might be okay. But overall, developing more flavor, just need to watch how and more acidity overall from the bread. But if it's in a controlled environment, people can go up to 18, 24 hours if you're using a natural levain, natural sourdough.
Sounds good. Peter, any hints?
Yeah, I think so much depends on what your fermentation method is. Are you using what your leavening is? Are you using commercial yeast? Are you using natural wild yeast that are loaded with lactic bacteria? And so time is such a factor. I always think of baking as a part of a triangle with time, temperature, and ingredients as the 3 points. So anything that affects one of those points affects the others. Long fermentation is long fermentation at a particular temperature? Is it at a refrigerated, put the dough to sleep temperature, which we call retarding? Is it at a warm temperature, which accelerates everything? So 5 hours is very relative to the temperature. And then it's also very relative to the choice of leavening. But if you want, there's no reason that you can't leaven a bread for 36 hours. I've seen, pizza doughs that go for 128 hours of fermentation, but at a very cold temperature. And it just gets more complex. The flavors become more complex over time. I think that most doughs have a certain peak and I always think about 24 to 36 hours being where it kind of peaks in terms of the complexity level, and anything beyond that is baker's choice and maybe subjective. But you can really bring out all the natural flavors of the wheat and the other ingredients through enzyme activity, through fermentation activity in that period of time. But 36 hours is way too long for a dough that's just fermenting on the tabletop.
That's true.
Unless you put just a tiny little bit of yeast.
So let's say for argument's sake, this is a wholesale baker who has a proofing box or whatever it is, a proofing room, that's doing it at about 90, 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Would 5 hours be enough? Maybe they've just fermented for 4 hours, and what if they go up to 5 hours? What kind of differences would you see in the dough?
This is very ballpark, but my working sort of theory is that every 17 degrees Fahrenheit essentially doubles the rate of fermentation. So at 95, if a dough doubles, let's say it doubles in size in the bulk fermentation in 2 hours at 80 degrees, then at 97 degrees, it's going to double in size in 1 hour. And
Right.
conversely, if you go the other way, it will take longer. Now that's ballpark. And so once again, it comes to this triangle. If 5 hours may be the perfect amount of time, but if it's too much time, but you would still want to make it happen in 5 hours, then maybe you have to cut back on the yeast.
Right.
And so, and that's all about, formulation. So it's an interesting question because there's no simple answer.
No.
The answer is it depends.
Welcome to my day, Peter. I
Yeah,
get questions like that every
And I'm
day.
sure that when people pay you a lot of money to answer questions like that, the first question you have to ask them back is show me your formula and tell me what you're trying to achieve. Because there's no one answer to that question.
So correct me if I'm wrong. My understanding is that 17-degree rule of thumb is more about the yeast and bacteria activity, whereas the enzymatic activity, the protease and amylase, they are not slowed down as much by reducing temperature, for example. So that's, I think, one of your original ideas of using the long cold fermentation that disproportionately slows down the yeast activity, but allows the protease to weaken the protein bonds and the amylase to make the dough sweeter.
Exactly.
So then you get that sweet and sour thing.
And I think that Lynn and Richard probably know the scientific side of this more than I do, especially when it comes to enzymes. Because for me, that enzyme breakthrough was simply about releasing flavor. But then I found out that the world of enzymes is fathomless. And I see that you write a lot about that, Lynn.
Yeah, enzymes do have an effect on the dough rheological part. Within an hour or 2 hours, I think at that temperature you'll see a difference in how slack the dough is. So that's something to look out for if you want to go from 4 to 5 hours of fermentation, or if you accidentally overproof it by 1 hour, you're going to see the effect of the proteases. You're going to have a slacker dough. You're going to have a more alcoholic taste to it. So I wouldn't recommend, going longer, because who really has the space to go longer? I think longer ferments only happen when there is a mistake somewhere or an equipment goes down, and then people are like, oh, can I use my sponge that I used to ferment for 4 hours and now it's like 8 hours? Can I use that again? We have lots of issues like that. So I say, to these things, it's like, I think 1 hour is workable, in terms of a sponge usage. But after 1 hour, when it gets to 2 to 3 hours, when the sponge is sitting on the floor and the equipment is still down, I say you have to remix it again, or else the dough will become too slack and you're going to have too much acids, and you're going to have, your bread is going to be really, instead of aromatic, it's going to be more alcohol. It's like drinking beer, so that's just my suggestion, but I think if you're 1 hour past the usual sponge time, it's still safe to use. But after that, you should be remixing.
But could you perhaps, let's say you've realized, oh my gosh, I'm going to be running behind today. I'm going to be an hour to 2 hours behind. Could you, without having to remix, could you just change the temperature and take it to a cooler place to slow things down a little bit?
Yes, you can.
Yes.
Depends on your size, right? I mean, if your batches are just like 500 pounds, not a problem. But if your batches are like 1,000, 1,500 pounds, it's hard to cool that big vat then.
That's true. And you guys are used to working with bakers at that scale.
Yeah.
Alan and I are used to working with bakers who are making, 20, 30, 40 loaves a day, so.
Right. I mean, we can approach this at all aspects, it's just cool to go down. But some facilities may not even have, places to cool. I mean, even some small scale bakeries will have no place to cool. I mean, their reefers are like walk-in, compact houses. You can't put anything in there.
Well, we see this a lot in the pizza world now. As I become more and more involved in the pizza communities, you see pizzerias that have ample refrigeration and others that have no refrigeration at all, and how each of them have to approach the way they ferment their doughs, whether they do a same-day dough versus a 3-day dough. And a lot of pizzerias love to work 1 to 2 or 3 days ahead so that they're always just pulling out the dough in time for the meals. But some places can't do that. So they have to time it, and they have to figure out the ratio of yeast to flour based on temperature. And if it's in an area where they don't even have good air conditioning, then even every day is an adventure for them and is a challenge. So it really comes down to a kind of a tightrope walk for some operations. But the ones who don't have refrigeration always look at the operations that do have lots of walk-ins, and they go, "Oh God, I would kill for a walk-in that size in my place, but I've got no room for it."
And there is one point, Lynn and Peter and Alan, to add, as the longer fermentation, we forgot to point out too, which have experience in bigger bakeries, is if you ferment it longer, the weakening of the doughs that you're using, because the rate of fermentation is not changing unless you control the rate of fermentation, but it's the dead yeast cells that are creating glutathiones. And therefore, I've seen people where all of a sudden the dough was like soupy, was starting to get soupy. I don't know what's going on. And because, again, you're talking about commercial bakeries, we're putting yeast foods and things to sugar to accelerate fermentation. As a rule of thumb, maybe it's useful for people, we would get on the fermentation, we'd take an 80, like as a sponge, we would take an 80-degree sponge, put it in the fermentation room at 85 degrees with an 80% relative humidity. And we were right on the point where we'd get 1 degree every hour. And 1 degree, and you could measure it and you would know. And temperature of the dough as you're fermenting, you're creating more heat. And that's something to think about.
Thank you, Richard. Well, thank you everyone for coming by today for our Tuesday 10 at 10. We all know how to reach out to you for your help. If you need Richard's help, it can be reached on our website as a consultant. And if you need to reach out to Peter, you can get him at pizzaquest.com.
Or you can write to me at peter@pizzaquest.com.
There you go. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you.
Alan.
Thank you.
Nice meeting you.